As a predator, he waited for them to be their most vulnerable. In all three instances, it was physical force forcing them into a car. She's been bound and gagged and sexually assaulted. It was devastating.
Over the course of his career, Chief Sean Keane spent 11 years pursuing a cold case that began in 1972. 19-year-old Pamela Milam vanished after attending a Sigma Kappa sorority rush party at Homestead Hall. Less than 24 hours later, her father made a discovery no parent should ever have to make. Pamela was found inside the trunk of her own car. At first glance, it seemed like just another tragic case, but the truth wouldn't come out for another 46 years. And in a cruel twist, the man responsible would never be held accountable. Was this another failure of the system, or did the killer manage to hide in plain sight for nearly half a century? Let's take a closer look. For 46 years, the murder of Pamela Milam remained a haunting void in the history of Terre Haute, Indiana. It was a case defined by the technological limitations of its era, a crime committed just before the dawn of modern forensic profiling, leaving a family to wait decades for a name that seemed destined never to emerge. The resolution of the case would eventually serve as a landmark testament to the power of genetic genealogy. But in the autumn of 1972, the city was a very different place, caught between a colorful, often dark history and the quiet rhythms of a Midwestern college town. Located on the western border of the state along the Wabash River, Terre Haute served as the capital of the Wabash Valley. By 1970, the city's population exceeded 70,000 residents, supported primarily by a robust manufacturing industry. To many, it was an ordinary Indiana city, yet Terre Haute carried the weight of a complex legacy. In the early 20th century, the town had developed a reputation for a sordid past, marked by dozens of brothels, political corruption, and the echoes of Prohibition-era gang warfare. However, by the time the 1970s arrived, that reputation had largely faded into the local lore. The city had transformed into an educational hub, home to St. Mary of the Woods College, the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, Ivy Tech Community College, and the institution at the center of the community, Indiana State University. It was here that 19-year-old Pamela Gail Milam was carving out a promising future. Born on May 9, 1953, in Illinois to parents Charles and Helen Milam, Pamela was the middle of three daughters, situated between her older sister, Charlene, and her younger sister and best friend, Sam. Described by those who knew her as good-willed and good-spirited, Pamela was a young woman of focused ambition and kindness. She was a sophomore English major at ISU, a path fueled by her status as a Hoosier Scholar, a prestigious merit-based award reserved for students dedicated to careers in education. This scholarship was a reflection of her academic discipline and her desire to shape the lives of others. Pamela was deeply embedded in campus life. She was a dedicated member of the Sigma Kappa sorority and participated in various clubs and church activities. Despite her heavy involvement on campus, she maintained close ties to her family, commuting to school from her parents' home on the south end of Terre Haute. She was a recognizable figure on campus, a young woman with a classic 1970s aesthetic, sporting blonde-brown hair, blue eyes, and glasses. Alongside her at the university were the two people who anchored her world, her younger sister Sam and her high school sweetheart, Dave Smith. On Friday, September 15, 1972, the atmosphere at Indiana State University was one of typical early semester excitement. The fall air was beginning to turn, and for Pamela, the weekend promised a series of milestone sorority events. The schedule was packed with meetings and rush parties, the high-energy social gatherings used by sororities to recruit new members. As a sophomore and an active member of Sigma Kappa, Pamela was an integral part of these festivities. She had planned to stay on campus for the weekend at the Lincoln Quad to be closer to the activities, a rare break from her daily commute. The evening began at 6:15 p.m. at the Men's Physical Education Annex, where Pamela attended a rush party that lasted until 10:30 p.m. Following the event, the focus shifted to a sorority meeting at Homestead Hall. At some point during the transition between the party and the meeting, or immediately following the meeting's conclusion, Pamela made a trip to her car, a 1964 Pontiac Le Mans, which was parked in Lot 22 on the ISU campus. She was seen carrying a box of party decorations, preparing for the days of recruitment still to come. Around 11 p.m., as the meeting at Homestead Hall broke up, Pamela spoke with her sorority sisters. She told them she intended to move her vehicle from Lot 22 to a spot closer to the Lincoln Quad, where she would be sleeping. She promised to meet them at the quad in just a few minutes to share a late dinner. Her sisters watched as she walked north, disappearing into the darkness between Homestead Hall and the Science Building, heading toward her car. It was a short, routine walk on a familiar campus, a moment of transition that should have been entirely unremarkable. The minutes following 11 o'clock slowly bled into hours, yet Pamela never arrived at the Lincoln Quad. In the context of a 1972 college campus, her absence did not immediately trigger a search or a sense of impending crisis. Without the instant connectivity of cellular phones or digital tracking, her sorority sisters were left to speculate on any number of benign possibilities. Perhaps she had encountered an old friend, decided to drive back to her parents' house on the south end of town, or simply succumbed to the exhaustion of a long week and gone to bed early. This lack of immediate alarm was a hallmark of the era's social fabric, a time when a young woman's brief disappearance was often rationalized as a change of plans rather than a cause for panic. The true nature of the situation began to emerge on the morning of Saturday, September 16th. Pamela was scheduled to work a 5-hour shift at the Indiana State University South Library, starting at 8 a.m. For a dedicated Hoosier scholar and reliable student, missing a work shift without notice was uncharacteristic. By 1 p.m., when her shift ended without her ever appearing, the concern among her inner circle began to mount. The tension reached a breaking point later that evening when her boyfriend, Dave Smith, arrived at the Lincoln Quad for their scheduled date. Finding no sign of Pamela and no record of her return the night before, Dave contacted her sister, Sam. As the families began to coordinate a search, a member of Pamela's sorority made a pivotal discovery. Parked in Lot 27, a different location from where Pamela had originally left her vehicle, sat her 1964 Pontiac Le Mans. The car had been backed into a parking space, a detail that would later be scrutinized by investigators as a possible attempt to obscure the license plate or facilitate a rapid exit. By this time, night had fallen again, and the campus was shrouded in darkness. Using a flashlight to peer through the glass, Pamela's friends noticed her eyeglasses resting on the rear window shelf, a sight that deeply unsettled them, as Pamela required the glasses for her daily activities. Upon receiving the news, Charles Milam and his daughter Sam drove immediately to the campus. Charles, carrying a spare set of keys, approached the vehicle with a sense of dread that would soon be realized. Upon unlocking the doors, they found Pamela's purse sitting in the back seat, but the interior was otherwise empty. The search ended at the rear of the car. When Charles turned the key in the trunk lock and lifted the lid, he and Sam were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Pamela's body lay inside, bound and gagged. In a moment that would remain etched in Sam's memory for the rest of her life, her father looked at the figure in the trunk and exclaimed, "There." For Sam, the discovery felt like a physical blow, an awful thing against which they were entirely powerless. The immediate area was cordoned off as the Terre Haute police began the grim task of processing a crime scene that had effectively become a mobile tomb. Pamela's body was transported to Union Hospital, where the forensic examination was conducted by the coroner, Dr. Robert Blake. The details revealed by the autopsy painted a picture of a calculated and cruel abduction. A gag had been forced into her mouth and secured with white masking tape. Her hands were pulled behind her back and bound tightly with a length of clothesline, and a second piece of the same cord had been wrapped around her neck. The medical examiner noted several curious details that suggested the trunk was not the initial site of the assault. He discovered small sticks, leaves, and other forest debris trapped between Pamela's pantyhose and her legs. This forensic evidence suggested that she had likely been taken to a wooded area, assaulted, and then redressed before being placed back into the car, inadvertently trapping the organic material against her skin. Scratches and abrasions marked her face, and a bruise was found on one of her knees, indicating a struggle. The cause of death was officially ruled as strangulation. Furthermore, a biological stain was identified on her blouse, a piece of evidence that would be preserved in the police archives, though its true value would remain locked away for decades, waiting for a science that did not yet exist. The investigation into Pamela Milam's murder was launched with a sense of urgency that gripped both the Terre Haute police and the university community. A young woman killed on a college campus was a headline-grabbing tragedy that shattered the perceived safety of Indiana State University, leaving students and residents in a state of heightened anxiety. Officers meticulously processed the 1964 Pontiac Le Mans for trace evidence, recovering 2 spools of clothesline, 2 rolls of duct tape, and soil samples from the vehicle's interior. A particularly chilling discovery was made when investigators realized that the box of party decorations Pamela had been carrying that Friday night was still in the car. Upon closer inspection, it became clear that the materials used to bind and gag her, the clothesline and the tape, had been taken directly from that box. The killer had used Pamela's own supplies against her, suggesting a crime of opportunity where the perpetrator had improvised with the items found within the vehicle. Police immediately began a massive canvassing effort, interviewing every member of the Sigma Kappa sorority. Despite the high volume of students on campus that weekend, no one could recall seeing Pamela after she walked away from Homestead Hall at 11 p.m. Witnesses did, however, provide descriptions of several individuals seen loitering on campus that evening who did not appear to be students. These men were described as being older, some with receding hairlines, standing in stark contrast to the typical college demographic. Every male associate in Pamela's life was placed under a microscope. Investigators administered polygraph tests to various acquaintances, and Pamela's high school sweetheart, Dave Smith, was subjected to intense scrutiny. However, after extensive questioning and background checks, police found no evidence linking Dave or any of Pamela's friends to the crime. Despite the thorough processing of the scene and the collection of fingerprints from the car door and Pamela's glasses, the technology of 1972 offered no immediate matches. The investigation was stalling until a series of violent events occurred just 7 weeks later, providing police with what appeared to be their primary suspect. In November 1972, authorities apprehended a man named Robert Austin. He was accused of committing a string of abductions on the ISU campus that bore a haunting resemblance to the circumstances surrounding Pamela's death. Austin's method of operation was consistent. He would approach young women in the early night or morning hours as they crossed public streets or moved between dormitories. He then forced them into his vehicle at gunpoint and drove them to remote, wooded areas. There, he subjected them to aggravated sexual assaults before returning them to the campus. During Austin's trial, the chilling testimonies of his survivors painted a picture of a predatory figure operating in the exact same geography where Pamela had vanished. One student testified to being abducted while walking between buildings, while another described a similar ordeal that began in the early morning hours. Although Austin had not murdered these women, the similarities in the timing, location, and the use of a vehicle for abduction led investigators to believe they had found Pamela's killer. Austin was eventually convicted of kidnapping and multiple counts of sexual assault, receiving a sentence that would keep him incarcerated for approximately 20 years. While Austin adamantly denied any involvement in the Milam case, the police remained confident in his guilt. At the time, such behavioral similarities carried significant weight. Investigators often relied on what is known as modus operandi, or criminal pattern analysis, to link cases. The prevailing belief was that Austin's crimes had escalated, that what began as abduction and assault had, in Pamela's case, turned into homicide. Based on the pattern of his known attacks, investigators believed Austin typically maintained control over his victims long enough to carry out the assault and release them. However, in Pamela's case, they theorized that something had gone wrong. Detectives considered the possibility that Pamela may have resisted more forcefully, or that the situation had escalated beyond Austin's control. In such scenarios, they believed the offender could resort to lethal violence in order to silence the victim or avoid identification. But belief was not the same as proof. In 1972, forensic science was still in its early stages. DNA profiling did not yet exist, and investigators had no reliable way to compare the biological evidence recovered from Pamela's clothing to a specific individual. Techniques available at the time, such as blood typing or microscopic hair analysis, were limited and often inconclusive. Without a direct forensic link, no matching fingerprints, no eyewitness placing Austin with Pamela, and no confession, the case could not meet the legal standard required for prosecution. And yet, for the community, the idea that the perpetrator was already behind bars brought a fragile sense of closure. It was a resolution built not on certainty, but on the best explanation available at the time. As the years turned into decades, the memory of the crime faded for the public, but for Pamela's family, the weight of the loss remained. Her younger sister, Sam, eventually graduated from ISU and built a career with the State Department in Washington, D.C., traveling the world but carrying the trauma of 1972 with her. She would later reflect on how the murder influenced her life choices, including her decision to remain unmarried, perhaps as a subconscious defense against the possibility of experiencing such a devastating loss again. Despite the passage of time, the case remained the coldest in Terre Haute, a silent mystery waiting for the evolution of forensic science. The arrival of the 21st century brought with it a revolution in forensic science that promised to breathe new life into stagnant investigations. In 2001, nearly 3 decades after Pamela's death, investigators returned to the evidence room with a renewed sense of purpose. Their focus was the blouse Pamela had been wearing on the night of her murder, specifically the biological stain identified during the initial autopsy. The goal was to extract a DNA profile that could finally confirm the long-held suspicion that Robert Austin was the perpetrator. By this time, Austin had served his sentence for the 1972 campus abductions and had been released from prison, living as a free man while the shadow of the Milam case still loomed over his name. However, the passage of time had taken a toll on the physical evidence. In 1972, the standard protocol for preserving biological material involved placing items in plastic bags, a practice that, unbeknownst to the officers of the time, created a destructive environment for genetic material. Plastic traps moisture, which in turn fosters the growth of bacteria that eats through the molecular structure of DNA. When the forensic team attempted to pull a profile from the stain, they found the sample heavily degraded. Despite the damage, they were able to isolate enough genetic material to produce a profile. To the profound disappointment of the Terre Haute Police Department, the DNA did not match Robert Austin. The investigative team then turned to CODIS, the combined DNA indexing system, hoping to find a match among the millions of known offenders across the country. Again, the system returned no hits. Even the technological leap of the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS, failed to provide clarity. The fingerprints lifted from the rear window shelf, Pamela's glasses, and the back door of the Pontiac did not match any individual in the national database. The case seemed to have entered a forensic purgatory, trapped between suspects who had been ruled out and a killer whose identity remained hidden in the digital void. The momentum shifted again around 2008 when Sean Keane, who would eventually become the chief of the Terre Haute Police Department, took a personal interest in the file. Keane became deeply immersed in the details of the 1972 crime, often taking the voluminous case files home and spreading them across his living room floor. For Keane, the challenge was as much historical as it was criminal. He had not yet been born when Pamela Milam was killed, and the Terre Haute he knew was physically and culturally distinct from the city of 1972. Buildings had been demolished, landscapes had shifted, and the student body had completely cycled through several generations. Keane identified 56 men who had been interviewed during the initial investigation. In 1972, the record-keeping had been minimal, typically consisting of only a name, an address, and a telephone number. Keane set about the monumental task of tracking these men down 4 decades later. He subpoenaed Indiana State University for historical student records and meticulously cross-referenced names with criminal databases to see if any of these individuals had committed similar violent offenses in the intervening years. He followed several promising leads, searching for patterns of behavior that matched the calculated nature of Pamela's abduction, but each trail eventually went cold. In an effort to generate fresh leads from unconventional sources, Keane also worked to include Pamela's case on a set of cold case playing cards. These decks were distributed throughout the Indiana Department of Corrections, featuring the faces and details of unsolved murders on the back of each card. The hope was that an inmate might recognize the case and provide information overheard in the prison system. While the initiative was a creative attempt to break the silence surrounding the case, it yielded no breakthroughs. Despite the mounting frustrations, Keane remained convinced that the answer lay within the biological evidence, and he continued to monitor the evolving field of genetics for a new way to bridge the gap between 1972 and the present. The stalemate finally broke in 2017 when the Terre Haute Police Department turned to a newer forensic method known as DNA phenotyping. This technology allowed investigators to analyze crime scene DNA to predict physical characteristics of the perpetrator, such as hair color, eye color, and skin tone. Chief Keane, still driven by a personal mission to provide the Milam family with answers, received the initial phenotyping results in December 2017. The report suggested a suspect with brown hair, brown eyes, and intermediate to dark skin. Keane spent months filtering through his existing files, re-examining every man who had been interviewed in 1972 who matched that physical description, but the efforts once again yielded no viable leads. Unwilling to concede, Keane decided to elevate the investigation by partnering with Parabon Nanolabs, a specialized genetic genealogy company that had gained national attention for solving decades-old cold cases. Working with Parabon meant committing the last remaining DNA evidence to a single approach. By 2018, the biological material recovered from Pamela's blouse was nearly exhausted. To build a usable DNA profile for genetic genealogy, Parabon would likely need to use the entire remaining sample. This meant that if the process failed, there would be no DNA left for future testing as technology continued to advance. Keane ultimately decided that after 46 years, the risk was necessary. When the first reports returned from Parabon, they presented an immediate and confusing contradiction. While the previous phenotyping had suggested a dark-complexioned suspect, Parabon's analysis indicated a man with fair hair and green or blue eyes. The discrepancy was later attributed to the fact that Parabon had access to a much larger and more high-quality sample, which they were able to test twice for accuracy. Using this new profile, the lab's genealogist began searching public databases such as GEDmatch, where individuals voluntarily upload DNA data to identify relatives. By tracing distant cousins and building out complex family trees, the genealogists eventually narrowed their focus to a specific branch of a family in southern Indiana. Chief Keene began a new round of interviews, traveling across the state to speak with individuals who could provide details about their brothers, cousins, and uncles who were active in the early 1970s. As investigators narrowed the family tree, one name began to stand out: Jeffrey Hand. The identification of Hand was further supported by a visual comparison. When Keene compared a 1970s-era photograph of Jeffrey Hand to the composite sketch created by Parabon's AI, the two images showed a clear match. Hand possessed the same blonde hair, green eyes, and facial structure predicted by the genetic data. At 23, he did not stand out on a college campus, unlike the older men described by witnesses in 1972. Hand was 23 years old at the time of Pamela's death and worked as a delivery driver for a record company, a job that required frequent travel across Indiana. It also provided a plausible reason for him to be near the Indiana State University campus at the start of the fall semester. A closer review of his background revealed earlier incidents from the early 1970s that provided additional context. In June 1973, less than a year after Pamela was found in the trunk of her car, Hand was involved in a violent crime. Around 9 p.m. on a summer evening, a newly married couple, Jeffrey Wayne Thomas and his wife, Carol Thomas, were hitchhiking along US 41 just outside Terre Haute. They were traveling home to Indiana after visiting family in Chicago when Hand, driving a turquoise 1968 Chevrolet, pulled over and offered them a ride. After nearly 2 hours of driving, Hand claimed he needed to stop at his home to retrieve an item. He pulled into a dilapidated farm on Warrington Road in Gibson County, where the situation turned lethal. Hand produced a .38 caliber revolver and announced a robbery. When Jeffrey Thomas laughed, believing it to be a joke given the couple only possessed a little over $1, Hand fired a shot into the roof of his own car to demonstrate his intent. He then forced Jeffrey to bind Carol's hands behind her back before locking her inside a grain bin on the property. Hand told the couple he was taking Jeffrey into town to secure a ransom, but the forensic evidence would later suggest that money was never the objective. While the men were gone, Carol managed a desperate escape, running to a nearby farmhouse to alert authorities. When police converged on the dark farm, they found only Jeffrey Hand. Jeffrey Thomas was missing. Following a period of interrogation and a conversation with his father, Hand confessed to the murder. He led investigators to a remote area on County Line Road in Posey County, where Thomas's body was discovered in tall weeds 42 feet from the roadway. The scene showed clear signs of extreme violence. Thomas's hands were still bound behind him. He was shot with a .22 caliber weapon, and further injuries indicated a sustained and violent attack. The volume of blood at the site indicated he had been murdered where he was found. During his competency hearing and subsequent trial in October 1973, Hand's behavior was erratic, marked by attacks on journalists and claims of profound melancholy. While one psychiatric doctor deemed him rational, a second argued that Hand suffered from severe mood swings and was incompetent to stand trial. The jury ultimately found Hand not guilty by reason of insanity. Under Indiana law in the 1970s, a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity was intended to recognize a fundamental legal principle: that a person who could not understand their actions at the time of the crime could not be held criminally responsible in the traditional sense. But cases like Hand's raised a difficult question. What happens when someone capable of extreme violence is later deemed recovered? In theory, the system relied on medical evaluations to determine when an individual was no longer a threat. In practice, however, those determinations were often based on limited observation and evolving psychiatric standards. That gap meant individuals could be released despite having committed extreme violence. For many, this raised difficult questions, not about whether mental illness should be considered, but whether the system, as it existed at the time, was capable of protecting the public. Because he was deemed restored to sanity in a remarkably short period, he served less than a total of 1 year in state institutions. By June 1976, Jeffrey Hand was a free man, returning to live with his wife and 2 children in Washington, Indiana. He was declared no longer a threat to society. Within 2 years, that judgment would be widely questioned as a failure of the system. On January 24, 1978, Hand struck again, this time at the Markland Mall in Kokomo, Indiana. Witnesses watched in horror as he abducted a woman at gunpoint in the shopping center parking lot and forced her into his vehicle. Howard County Sheriff's Deputy Vernal Baugh responded to the radio call and managed to intercept Hand's car in a nearby plaza. Hand abandoned the vehicle and the victim, fleeing into a nearby alleyway. When ordered to stop, Hand drew a .32 caliber revolver and opened fire, striking Deputy Baugh twice. Other officers arriving on the scene engaged in a pursuit, shooting Hand as he attempted to reach a set of railroad tracks. He crawled beneath a freight car where he succumbed to his wounds. While Deputy Baugh survived the encounter, Jeffrey Hand took his secrets to the grave, and his name remained entirely absent from the Pamela Milam case files for another 40 years. The forensic loop had finally closed. The man who had haunted the Milam family's thoughts for nearly half a century was not a ghost or a red herring like Robert Austin. He was a violent offender who had been stopped by a deputy's bullet in a Kokomo alleyway only 6 years after Pamela's death. The technology of 2019 had finally reached back through time to provide the definitive proof that the era of 1972 could not. That conclusion was formally confirmed when investigators announced that the DNA evidence identified Jeffrey Hand as the person responsible for Pamela Milam's murder. In May 2019, Chief Sean Keane stood before a room of reporters and family members to officially close the oldest cold case in Terre Haute history. The announcement that Jeffrey Hand was the man responsible for the 1972 murder of Pamela Milam was a watershed moment for the department, marking the end of nearly 5 decades of uncertainty. For Pamela's surviving sisters, Charlene Sanford and Sam Milam, the revelation brought a complicated mixture of profound relief and lingering sorrow. They spoke publicly of the immense weight that had been lifted from their shoulders, a burden of not knowing that had defined their adult lives. Sam Milam, who had been a student alongside Pamela at Indiana State University, reflected on the decades she spent battling post-traumatic stress and depression, noting that her sister's death had fundamentally altered her perception of safety and human connection. The sisters expressed a singular, poignant regret that their parents, Charles and Helen Milam, had both passed away years earlier without ever learning the identity of their daughter's killer. Their father, who had been the one to find Pamela in the trunk of the Pontiac, had gone to his grave with only the haunting image of that Saturday night in Lot 27. The resolution of the Milam case also opened a broader investigative window into the shadow years of Jeffrey Hand's life. Between 1972 and his death in 1978, Hand had moved frequently across Indiana, living in Washington, Gibson County, and eventually Kokomo. His occupation as a record delivery driver placed him on a constant circuit of the state's college towns and rural highways, creating a geographic profile typical of a traveling predator. This realization has led modern investigators to look closely at other unsolved homicides from that era, specifically the 1972 murder of 25-year-old Vicki Lynn Harrell. Harrell had disappeared from Bloomington, Indiana on August 12, 1972, just 1 month before Pamela Milam was killed. Her body was discovered in a ditch near McCormick's Creek State Park in Spencer, Indiana. The geography of the Harrell case is particularly striking when viewed through the lens of Jeffrey Hand's movements. Bloomington is located roughly 60 miles southeast of Terre Haute, and the direct route between the two cities is State Road 46. Harrell's body was discarded directly along this corridor, less than 20 miles into the trip from Bloomington toward Terre Haute. Given that Hand was a known delivery driver who frequently traversed these routes, and considering his demonstrated capacity for extreme violence and abduction, the proximity of these crimes suggests a much larger and, perhaps still partially hidden, trail of victims. The story of Pamela Milam is more than a chronicle of a singular crime. It is a study in the persistence of justice and the evolution of the human spirit. The case serves as a stark reminder of the limitations of the past, where a killer could be found not guilty by reason of insanity and returned to the streets within months, or where a microscopic stain could be rendered unreadable by a simple plastic bag. Yet, it also highlights the ingenuity of the present, where investigators like Chief Keene refuse to let a file remain closed simply because the calendar pages have turned. Today, the 1964 Pontiac LeMans and the Sigma Kappa decorations are long gone, but the legacy of the investigation remains. The use of genetic genealogy in the Milam case has become a blueprint for cold case units across the country, proving that no case is truly beyond reach so long as biological evidence exists. For the Milam family, the bitter ending of 1972 has finally been replaced with a definitive truth. While no amount of forensic data can restore the life of a 19-year-old girl with a passion for education, the identification of Jeffrey Hand has ensured that Pamela Gail Milam is no longer defined by the mystery of her death, but by the relentless effort of those who refuse to forget her name.